Hi, it's time for a Chime video. So a lot of attention gets paid to the more complex, more elaborate, long tube and 8-note bar chimes that NuTone made in the 50s and 60s. But for some reason, we've been neglectful and we've ignored, for the most part, the more typical, perhaps ordinary, 2-note NuTone mechanical chimes that they made in the same time period. So in today's video, we're going to have a quick look at this NuTone chime. This is a Model K14, and if you look really carefully inside here, it has a very clear date code. It says May 1955. The K14 is a recessed door chime. In fact, when it's installed in someone's house, it goes like this, and here it says clearly, it says top. And this is a recessed 2-note door chime. So there would be a mounting box that would be slightly bigger than this that gets installed in the wall during construction, and the wiring comes into that box. And then upon trimming out the system, when the house is just about complete, this inner portion gets mounted into the recessed box, and then it would have a decorative cover on it. Back in those days, it was most likely an anodized aluminum louvered cover, and I can show you a picture of what that kind of looked like. Now, this is a catalog page out of a 1959 NuTone catalog, and by 1959, chimes, instead of being K-model chimes, they became L-model chimes, but it's essentially the same door chime. So here it shows an L14 built-in, which is what it was called, in ivory, not anodized gold. Ivory finished cover may be painted to match walls, 2 notes for the front door, 1 note for the rear door, and it has dimensions, and it weighs 2 pounds and 10 ounces. What's interesting about this is NuTone still today makes a recessed door 2-note door chime that's very similar to this. It's not the same mechanism, it's probably not the same louvered cover, but recessed 2-note door chimes have always been in the NuTone product line, even through today, which is 2022. The thing to keep in mind about a model like our K14, which was one model up from the entry-level model. The entry-level model would have been a K12, and the K12 was called the Champion, and that was a standard 2-note surface-mounted door chime. The Champion, back in, say, 1955, would have cost $5.95. This K14 would have cost $6.95. So these are door chimes that everyone could afford. Instead of spending $60, $70, or $80 on an 8-note long tube or bar chime, which was a lot of money in the middle 1950s, the average ordinary person or a builder building a development of houses could afford to install a 2-note NuTone door chime in every single house, and of course that's what NuTone really wanted. So let's look at the basic parts of a chime like this, because like I said in the beginning of the video, these chimes get often overlooked, and that's rather unfair because these are very high quality chimes with a very nice sound to them. So what do we have? Well, we have a metal box because this is a recessed chime. If it was a surface mounted chime, you would have a metal base. So it's metal all the way around. You have 2 metal resonators, one here, a short one, and one here, a tall one, and these are metal, round cylindrical metal cans, and there are openings which I'll show you in it. And the purpose of these are, it amplifies the sound that the tone bars make when the plungers strike the tone bars. It works on the same principle as why acoustical guitar has a big opening in the face of the guitar where the strings go over it, because that amplifies the sound that the strings make. This does exactly the same thing. In the center, you have the power unit assembly, which is 2 electromagnetic coils, and then you have plungers with springs and tips and screw terminals to connect wires to. These are standard 2-note wiring layouts where you have the center terminal is for your transformer wire, and then you can connect your button to either front or rear. Front is 2 notes, so it's ding dong, and rear is a single note, so it's just ding. So it's a 2-note, 2-door chime because you can have front door and rear door. So let's take a look at how this is put together, because now we're going to take it apart. Oh, by the way, this one has already been serviced. This was sent in by a customer. It was not operational because basically it was just old and tired. And as we take it apart, I'll talk about what I found, because these are relatively simple to get working again because there isn't much to go wrong with them. Now, to take this apart, you have to take the resonators out first to get to the screws that hold the power assembly in. And to do that, there are screws on the back, and we need a standard screwdriver because this is not in the days of Phillips screws. This is the days of slotted screws. And then since we're taking it apart, of course, we're going to put our screws in the metal cup because we don't want to lose the original screws or just lose the screws in general. So we'll unscrew the resonators. The customer that sent this in had just bought the house recently. He liked the idea of keeping the chime, and so he sent it to me for repair. So here are our resonators. There's the short one and there's the tall one. And you can see on the top of the tall one, there's an opening here, just like the opening in a guitar. And in the little one, there's an opening in the bottom. So we'll put those aside. And now we can gain access to the screws that hold the power assembly in place. And also you can see the tone bars here at the top and at the bottom. And these are held on to little threaded studs, and there are little grommets that hold the tone bars. The grommets hold the tone bars in place, but give them enough flexibility, enough wiggle, so when the plungers strike them, they don't deaden the sound they make, and that's the purpose of it. Lots of times what happens on these is the grommets get really hard and the tone bars aren't floppy enough, or they're missing altogether and so forth, but in this case, it's not really a problem. So let's go ahead and we'll take the power unit assembly out. It was kind of nice the way they designed this because all of the screws, all 6 of them, are exactly the same. And now we have our empty housing. And if you look really carefully right here, you probably can see May 1955, it says K14 and VB. I'm not sure what VB is, but maybe that's the person who stamped it, or maybe it's something else. Put that aside. And here's our power unit assembly. So you have 2 electromagnetic coils inside. I'm not taking this apart because there's no reason to. And then you have your 2 plungers. So the front door plunger, which is this one, has tips on both ends, here at the top and here at the bottom. And the rear door, which is a single note, only has a tip on the bottom. So I'm going to lift these out, put them aside for a second, and show you, I think you can see, the solenoids the coils for the solenoids are wrapped around brass tubes, like most 50s and 60s NuTone chimes had. And like most of these chimes, so this chime was 100% original when the customer sent it to me. Nothing had ever been done to it as far as I can tell. And the inside of the brass tubes, they get dirty and oxidized and pick up all kinds of contaminants from cooking and frying and whatever else goes on, smoking perhaps. In those days, in those houses, they were very dark and kind of gummy. And I don't know if you can really see or not, but now they're nice and shiny inside because they've been thoroughly cleaned and honed with some 2000 grit sandpaper. They're shiny and clean, and that allows the plungers to slide through them freely, which is what's necessary. The other thing that was wrong with this chime had to do with the plungers. So on each plunger is a spring, and here's the spring. And it's held in place in a groove on the top of the plunger. The coils of the spring become smaller and smaller diameter until they're just a little bit smaller than the groove itself, and then it snaps into place. What we do on these to make sure that the springs stay in the grooves, because this is old and the metal, I think, gets fatigued as it gets older, is once we put it in place, I use a little bit of gel super glue, just the littlest bit, and you put it in the groove in one side and the other to hold the coil of the spring into the groove to make sure it doesn't pop loose later on, because we don't want any callbacks on a door chime. The plungers themselves, the metal part here, when I took this chime apart originally, the surface of the metal has oxidized and was very dirty, so it was a very dull, flat gray. when I took these all apart, I took the springs off carefully and put them in a metal cup so I didn't lose them. Oh, I should point out at this point that there are no parts available for chimes like this. As simple as they are, you need to have the right springs. It has to fit into the groove properly. It has to be the right length. There's all of these little details about this. And if you lose the spring, you're out of luck. I took it all apart and I very carefully honed the surface of the plunger with some 2000 grit sandpaper to remove the grime and oxidation and 65 years worth of crud that was on it, and they shined right up and now they slide nice and freely. The other problem with these, which is a problem with a lot of 1950s NuTone chimes, was the plunger tips, the white parts now, the plunger tips were missing. So two of them, these two, were missing altogether. And this one, this is the rear door, so it only has a single tip because it's only a single note. This one, the original tip was red, and it had been pushed back into the hole in the end of the plunger. So it was still there, but it was pushed all the way back in, so it wasn't sticking out far enough to hit the tone bar anymore. This has the same spring on it. You do have to be careful on some NuTone chimes where the springs that are used on the front door plunger may be different than the springs used on the rear door plunger. Why they did that, I don't know exactly, because you would think that just makes it overly complicated, but that's the way it is. In this case, the springs are the same. However, when I take them apart and take them off, I usually mark which spring goes on which plunger just to put it back the way that it was. On the other end of the rear door plunger on the top, there is no tip. However, there is supposed to be a cushion, because if it does pop up too far, which it generally would not, you don't want it hitting the tone bar at the top. So what we do, since the cushion piece was missing as it always is, I use one of those little felt cabinet bumpers that you can buy at the local hardware store. In fact, I have it here. I always buy these bigger ones like this. This is like 3/4 of an inch around, and I have a round die tool and punch out the size that I need from it, and then a little, it's got adhesive on it but it's not very strong, so a little dab of super glue and you glue the felt piece on the top, and that creates the cushion. So what we did with these was we made new tips for them because these two were missing. This tip could have been used over the original red one, possibly could have been used over, but the problem with doing that is two things. One, the problem with the original tip, and this was a good way to explain it, was the hole in the end of the plunger is deeper than the length of the tip. So the red tip was somewhat threaded into the end of the plunger, but then there was a void or a space above it, and that's why over the years of hitting it, it got driven back inside until it wasn't sticking out at all. It's not a good way to do it. You would have thought that they would have put it in far enough that it would have seated against the bottom of the hole, but that's not the way they made them. So what we do when we make plungers is we use the tip material that we have and make it extra long and fit it all the way down into the bottom of the hole, so it's resting against the base of the hole so it can't get pushed back in. These, again, when I insert these, I use a little bit of super glue gel, not the liquidy kind. Gel is better because it doesn't run all over the place, and sort of glue them in place. The reason that's a good way to do it is the tip's not going to fall out like these two had fallen out. And also, the super glue is easy to break the adhesion with because you can simply lay a soldering iron on this and let it heat up the metal a little bit, and it'll soften the super glue and you can pull the tip back out. So that's an easy way to do it. So this one, and the other reason we did tips all the way around was because door chimes are all about, at the end, what they sound like. If it doesn't sound right, it doesn't matter how good of a job you did because it sounds wrong, and it's all about what the sound is. So the thing I've learned in fixing thousands of door chimes is the more uniform you make everything, the better off it's going to be at the end. Since we have to make two tips here, we made a third tip for this one because now they're all the same, and that way when it rings, it sounds correct. While we're on the topic of tips, the type of material that you use to make the tips affects how the chime sounds. The very earliest NuTone chimes, the ones made in the 1930s and early 1940s, the tips were all made out of wood. I don't know what kind of wood it was exactly. It's sort of a semi-hardwood. That gave the chimes a certain sound that they were looking for. And also I think in those days there was a lot in the way of plastics. In the late 1940s, 8-note chimes, the bar chimes and the long tube chimes, the plungers actually had leather tips. And leather tips for plungers that strike brass tubing or tone bars are more commonly seen in like long tube clocks. My friend Marv, the clock guy, told me all about that. And you can actually buy special leather material that's meant for plunger tips and all that sort of stuff. But that was sort of all abandoned in the early 1950s, and then they went to plastic tips. Plastic tips are great, but they do tend to crack and break off sometimes, and when we repair these, we don't want that to happen. So what I've settled on, which I've used for the last 15 years or so, is these are pieces of fiberglass rod. And fiberglass rod is not going to break or chip. It's very, very strong. It's easy to shape and it's easy to fit into the existing holes because, of course, you cannot find material that's exactly the right diameter that fits in the hole in the plunger for every model that NuTone has ever made. So you start with material that's larger diameter and you simply put it in a cordless drill and you spin it against a piece of sandpaper to sort of file it down a little bit until it fits in properly. It needs to be a snug fit because it has to be straight, but that's just the way we do it, and everyone seems to be happy with the result, especially me. So once the solenoid bores have been cleaned and the plungers have been cleaned and new tips were made and springs were reinstalled, they can go back in their solenoids. And what you want is it's got to move freely. It's got to be bouncy and free, and that's what it takes. The solenoids, the electromagnetic coils, they only generate so much force, and any amount of drag will affect how the whole thing works. So these are now ideal. They move nicely. And what we're going to do is we're going to put this back together and let you actually hear what it sounds like. And this is a little fiddly. I was thinking about, when I was putting this back together the very first time, how some person in Cincinnati, Ohio, would have sat there probably on some form of an assembly line and put these same little screws back in the same little holes to put this together the very first time. Don't know who that was. Don't know how fast they had to go. Perhaps they had much smaller fingers than I did, so it was easier for them to get the screws into the holes. All right. Now, one of the things I'm going to try to show is, and it's a little hard to do, is I'm going to push this plunger down, and you can't really duplicate it when it hits the bottom without it being powered up, but we can push it down and then release it, and you can listen to the sound it makes when it hits the top tone bar. Pretty unimpressive, isn't it? Now, let's go ahead and put our resonators back in. And this is a little tricky because you have to line up the holes in the resonators with the holes for the screws, and I don't know exactly how they did this when they put this together when it was new, but I would imagine it was kind of the same thing, or perhaps they had some sort of jig set up that held things in place to make it go faster. I often tell people one of the things, or two of the things, that made NuTone successful, especially in these days, because you know there were other companies that made door chimes. Most of them didn't last. The two things that NuTone was better at than anybody else, as far as I know, is one was marketing their chimes or their products. And with the door chimes in particular, I think one of the strokes of genius was they gave names to their chimes. And the names apparently were well thought out because they tend to suit what the chime is. Now this one has a fairly utilitarian name. It's called the built-in, but that's what it is. But other chimes have other names. In fact, I had a fella email me over the weekend. He just bought a house. It has a NuTone chime, and he was curious about it. And he sent me some pictures of it. And my description of the chime is it's a chord tone chime, so it rings 2 notes on the press of the button and a single note on the release of the button. It has satin chrome tubes and a smoked plexiglass cover that allows you to see the inner workings of the chime to some degree. It's an early 80s chime, and that chime is called either the Dusk, or in later catalogs it was called the Twilight. And if you heard it ring and you were thinking Twilight, you would know that was the perfect name for that chime. So naming chimes was that. The other thing that NuTone was particularly good at was controlling the cost of manufacturing. They always found ways to get things done and not have it cost as much as before, because controlling cost is important when you're a manufacturer. All right, so now it's all reassembled. So let's go ahead and try this. We'll push this down. Now listen again. Substantially different because we now have the resonators in place, and that amplifies the sound. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop and I'm going to hook this up so you can actually hear it ring. All right, I've got it hooked up. It's just wired up on a 16-volt power supply and a standard original NuTone doorbell button. It's from 2022, not from 1955, but buttons are buttons. This is not a lit button, this is an unlit button because that's the one I use. And I've got it wired up for 2 notes for the front door, so we'll go ahead and ring it. And you can hear how much louder it is once it's all being reassembled, because the resonating tubes are what amplifies the sound. And it has a nice cheery ding-dong sound. If we move the wire from the front terminal to the rear, we can get a single note for the back door. It's the milk delivery guy. And you can see, if you watch the plunger carefully as it rebounds, it comes very close to hitting the tone bar, but not quite, because it's controlled by the length and the tension that builds up in the spring. But just in case it would happen to hit it, we have our cushion on it, so it wouldn't really make much in the way of sound. So that's a quick look at a NuTone K14 built-in door chime from 1955. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps for someone it will be helpful. These are very nice door chimes and are certainly worth keeping. The next time I get one of these in, I'll do a video about cleaning the solenoids and the plungers and so forth, so you can see how that goes. It's a pretty easy do-it-yourselfy kind of project, so not as challenging as an 8-note chime is, and it's something that most people, I think, could do themselves if they're kind of organized, and if you have the metal cup so you don't lose the parts, because that happens too many times. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications, and every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.